Hello, buenas tardes. Here we are at beautiful Porto Alegre, Brazil. I'm James Cockcroft. This is Contra Corriente. And I'm going to be interviewing today a fascinating historical figure, very active in the social struggles of the world today, Bernardine Dorn. I myself am a writer of books on Latin America and children's books and poetry, and a professor at the State University of New York. And let's get right to Bernardine Dorn and find out who she is and her thoughts on the state of the world. Bernardine,
Jim,
who are you?
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you in Porto Alegre.
Exactly. Here we are at the World Social Forum 2005.
Your first one.
My first one.
Aye.
At 63.
Wonderful. Tell us who you are.
Well, I'm a United States citizen who lives in Chicago. I'm a mother and a grandmother. I'm a professor of law at Northwestern University in Chicago. I run a children's rights project and I teach juvenile justice and human rights law. I've been an activist for 45 years. In the 60s, I became part of the anti-war, anti-racism movement in the United States. I grew up in the Midwest of the United States with no political radical background. I learned about U.S. imperialism and racism on the ground level when I was a college student and a law student. I actually learned from Dr. Martin Luther King because he came to Chicago when I was a young law student, and I went to work on the west side of Chicago in the poorest African American communities of Chicago, trying to get habitable housing and open housing, non-discriminatory housing with Dr. King's organizers in Chicago. I learned a lot about basic grassroots organizing. I learned a lot about, we had a slogan then called "The people with the problems are the people with the solutions," what we would call today popular power or popular empowerment. Dr. King had strategies where the organizers would go door to door, hold meetings in a slum building on the west side of Chicago, ask people what was wrong with their building: no heat, leaking roofs, rats and roaches, unsafe windows, no hot water for bathing the children, unsafe front doors. And then they would turn to me, who I was a law student, first-year law student at the time, and they would say, "She's going to tell us about the law." And I would say, well, there's a requirement in Chicago that buildings, in order to pay your rent, the buildings must be habitable. And so because your building isn't habitable, you can pay your rent into an escrow account, a special bank account that you'll set up, and use that money to bring your building up to code. And they can't evict you if you do that. This is really implementing the notion that people can solve their own problems. And our job as law students at the time was to prevent everybody from being evicted.
Of course.
And then on the weekends, we would have these, Dr. King would lead these amazing 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 person marches for desegregated housing in Chicago, open housing marches they were called, into the all-white neighborhoods where he was met with a lot of local white power kind of violence. So for me, this was my first eye-opening experience into the world, into community organizing, into how racism is thoroughly embedded into the fabric of American life. And by the end of that summer, there was a vibrant tenants' rights movement created. But more and more, this was the summer of 1966, I was being asked about draft because so many young men, African American and Latino men, poor whites in the United States, were being drafted and sent to Vietnam. And so I increasingly became involved with the anti-war movement, with the military resistance movement, and with the draft movement. And 2 years later, I became the head of the large national student organization in the United States called SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. And I traveled and spoke, traveled all over the world, went and met with the Vietnamese in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and in Canada and in Cuba. It's my first trip to Cuba, a meeting with the Vietnamese that the Cubans helped to host there. I was part of a group of people who went underground in the United States. I was a federal fugitive. I was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for 8 years, 9 years.
This is the Weatherman faction of SDS?
The Weather Underground faction.
The Weather Underground faction.
Yes. And we carried out a series of kind of symbolic actions against the U.S. war in Vietnam and against racism and the murder of Black Panther Party leaders at home, in support of the prison rebellions at Attica and in San Quentin, and in support of the people of Chile after the U.S. involved overthrow of President Allende in Chile. So I was a fugitive for 11 years.
Wow.
Hard to imagine now. I had 2 children while I was a fugitive, and by the time that I went back to resume my current identity, the previous charges had been dropped against me because of governmental misconduct in the kind of wake of the debacle in Vietnam and the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, decisive defeat in Vietnam. A secret government program called Counterintelligence Program of the FBI. COINTELPRO was exposed. There were some modest reforms of the FBI. 2 top FBI officials were indicted in part for their involvement in trying to find us. And so the charges, when I turned myself in, the charges against me were all dropped due to governmental misconduct. So I was only facing demonstration charges in Chicago.
I'm sure that our viewers want to know your opinion, your analysis of the situation in U.S. society today, in your home country.
Dr. King, in his last year, 1967, right before he was killed, said something that I find rings as true today, all these years later. He said, with great sadness, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own country. I think that any discussion about the United States must begin with the fact that U.S. empire was never defeated. There were some constraints, I think, put on use of U.S. aggression in the world so that it took place in other ways in the intervening 30 years, many wars, proxy wars, and many forms of aggression by the United States. But really, it was not until 9/11 that
Not the 9/11 in Chile.
Not the 9/11 in
1973.
1973.
Washington.
2001. The attacks on the World Trade Center, I think, emboldened and enabled the most militarist, reactionary, vicious, aggressive forces to declare permanent war. We're in a state of permanent war against undefined enemies and any country, apparently. It's led to an expansion of, as you know, U.S. military bases, maybe 1,000, hundreds of them all over the globe, including in Latin America. Expansion and strengthening and entrenchment of U.S. military occupation of countries. I often say that American citizens today, by and large, don't know who we are and don't know where we are. I ask my students regularly, intelligent, highly competitive law students or graduate students. What percentage of the world's population are United States citizens? People have no idea that we're 4.8% of the world's people, because the feeling of entitlement and power and privilege and supremacy is so embedded in our culture. And why would 4.8% of the world's people control more than 50% of the world's wealth? Why do we have a right to the world's oil? Why do we have a right to claim superiority about democracy or women's rights or anything for that matter? So I think that the expansion, Dr. King used to talk about 3 great pillars of U.S. power in the world that made it the greatest purveyor of violence. I think they still hold true. He talked about militarism, talked about racism, and he talked about consumerism, which I would say was capitalism. And I think those 3 forces so shape American culture at the moment. The media, the education system, the healthcare system, that people in many ways are befuddled. Now, within that, there's great opposition. I'm very hopeful in many ways. I think there's a lot of radical organizing inside the United States. The anti-globalization movement is alive and well in the United States. It's growing. You don't hear about it. They haven't been able to impact policy, but young people want to know who we are in the world and want meaning. I believe profoundly still that people are meaning makers, that people want in their life not just stuff, but want actually to make a difference. We're told every day, all the time, that what we do won't make a difference, that we're hopeless, helpless, powerless, pitiful, and that but in fact we're told that all the time because potentially we're so powerful. And I think that, you know, there are huge sectors in the United States who are out of work. Labor unions are growing smaller. The workforce is working without benefits, much of it below the minimum wage in the United States. Whole sectors of young people are thrown out of school at very young ages and left really with the alternative of prison. We have the largest prison population per person in the world. We have over 2 million people incarcerated on any given day in the United States. The overwhelming majority of them people of color, young men of color, African American, Latino, Asian Americans. The overwhelming majority of the people incarcerated in the United States are there for nonviolent offenses. People are afraid of crime, afraid of young people of color, but in fact, most of the offenses that people are incarcerated for are nonviolent offenses, often drug offenses or property offenses. So population, the control of potentially rebellious populations in the United States has been affected in several ways. One is by pushing them toward prison. Another is by a so-called voluntary draft, which puts a lot of young men with no jobs and no resources, and young women now, into the military to fight. Most of the people who joined the U.S. military in the last decade had no idea that they were going to be fighting a war. They joined during the 90s when officially the U.S. wasn't engaged in wars abroad. They joined in order to get some job skills, in order to get a year of college paid for by the military, because their family was in the military and they were pressured to do what their father and their grandfather had done for a variety of reasons. But they didn't really join to go fight and conquer the world. And I think one of the interesting contradictions that's happening today because of the U.S. occupation of Iraq, because of the incredible violent damage done to the people of Iraq, first by the 10 years of sanctions and now by the brutal and really unprecedented bombing of cities, of civilian targets, and the invasion and now attempt to occupy what is obviously a non-occupiable country and population, is that young people, tragically, U.S. people in the military, are having to make sense of the world while being shot at, while being frightened, while watching their fellow GIs be wounded and be shipped back to the U.S. So it's a very dynamic situation. I think there's a fairly significant proportion of people who are refusing to go back after being sent to the United States. There's a large network now of families of people in the military who oppose their kids being shot at. Just this week in the House of Representatives, some 30 Congress people called for the immediate withdrawal of all U.S. troops. That's a little bit of courage from what has been an absolutely pathetic legislative branch of government who've been willing to go along with everything this Bush administration wants. So I think I've only given you just a little bit of a feeling, but I think that the situation, the Bush administration has attacked so many of the modest gains that were made in the last 50 years by the women's movement, reproductive rights, equality, dignity. They have attacked on every front the gains that have been made. Affirmative action, access to college by African American and Latino youth in the United States. So many of these gains have now been taken away. Now Social Security for old people is on the chopping block. And the economy of the United States is not in good shape. We're deeply in debt, a terrible balance of trade. Jobs are not forthcoming. This administration has lost jobs before 9/11 and after 9/11. So I think that it looks monolithic, but I think that it's also a very dynamic situation. I'm not at all confident that President Bush is going to last for 4 years. I think it's up to us to make sure that he doesn't last for 4 years. And I think it's up to us to build a movement, a radical movement. And there's a lot of organizing going on. It hasn't quite coalesced as a movement, but I think when we put more than 500,000 people in the streets of New York on the opening day of the Republican National Convention, I'm hopeful because it's a huge cross-class sector of American life that come there with a wide variety of demands on their government. I think that the majority of the American people oppose the war in Iraq. They know they were lied to about the reasons for going to Iraq. No weapons of mass destruction, no connection between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. And now they know that this government is explicitly sanctioning and giving a hypocritical legal justification for torture. That every aspect of their aggression in Iraq is in violation of international law, of human rights, and of domestic U.S. law. We find out, interestingly enough, during these hearings in the last week, that they're afraid, government officials, that they could be indicted as war criminals. And indeed they could. You look at the bombing of Fallujah. The bombing of Fallujah should be seen by the people of the world as the Guernica of our times. A civilian population, an ancient city, leveled just to show what firepower and what overwhelming military force can do, just to shock and awe, as they say, just to terrorize. And it was a strategy, the whole invasion of Iraq, and certainly the seizing of Fallujah, the flattening of Fallujah, was a strategy of terror, of official government terror. And will be seen as that by history. I'm confident of that. The taking of hospitals, the removal of the entire population of Fallujah, the failure to let anyone know how many people have been killed. American media is relying on British medical research. The article in Lancet last month to tell us how many Iraqi civilians have been killed in the last 2 years during the war. They're relying on a British study of Iraqi civilian deaths. I find that extraordinary in the sense that it should be everybody's demand to know who's being killed in our name and why. This is civilian population. This is terrorism. This is the face of real terrorism, which is taking the greatest military power of all times and applying it to a civilian population who committed no crimes. So, we have our work cut out for us as Americans, obviously. I just migrated from your question about what's going on inside the United States to a bit of discussion about what's going on outside the United States.
But apparently what's going on inside the United States is related to U.S. foreign policy and actions around the world. So feel free, please, to continue to give us your opinion of the situation of the world while you're at it. And towards the end of our hour, Contra Corriente, aquí en el Foro Social Mundial, número 5, give us your views also on Cuba. I understand you've been to Cuba. Venezuela, you've been there recently. And Latin America, if you would be so kind.
Well, I guess I take hope sometimes by thinking about how imperial power has its own problems. The United States is very overextended in the world. You'll remember that Che Guevara said 2-3 many Vietnams at the height of the Vietnam War, when liberation struggles were on fire across Latin America and Africa. I think part of what inspired the movements of the 60s and 70s across the globe, of course, was the Cuban Revolution. And the revolutions in Africa and the struggle of the Vietnamese people, all of whom taught us that it requires really an active imagination. It requires artists and comedians to teach us that there may be another way, that we are not only competitive, individualistic, consuming, ruthless, and vicious animal people, but we are also potentially collaborative, cooperative, communal people who haven't begun to tap the human potential in everyone, and that the largest untapped resource in the world really is human potential. I think that sense that together we can be yet imagined things is really what inspired people around the globe before and again now today. So I look very much, I'll swing back to your question about Cuba in particular. I love Cuba. I think Cuba has been, for people in the United States and people all over the world, a beacon of hope that another way is possible, that social struggle can succeed against overwhelming odds, that a tiny country can resist unrelenting, how long has it been? 45 years of unrelenting aggression, covert action, invasion, subversion, and actually survive. Survive in many ways with sectors that are the admiration of the whole world and the inspiration of the whole world. You're the expert on that. I'm not. But I look to the struggle in Chiapas, for example, with great hope and enthusiasm. And I look at the fact that General Pinochet is indicted all these years later with great satisfaction that, however delayed, that justice, a bit of justice, is happening, not just in the courts in Chile, but among the Chilean population today for the terrible crimes there. And hopefully that indictment of General Pinochet will have legs up in Washington, D.C., because everyone knows the documents are clear that the United States was involved, that Kissinger in particular, but the United States government was involved in planning, arming, financing, plotting, and covering up the murder of the democratically elected leader of Chile in 1973. I'll tell you a funny story. My son, my youngest son, I have 3 sons, was living and studying in Chile a couple of years ago. And on the morning of September 11th, when the first plane struck the World Trade Center, I was at an airport in Chicago taking my middle son to the airport to send him back to college. It was the beginning of the school year for him, September 11th. And I had dropped him at the airport, and then he called me and said, something's happened, planes aren't taking off, come get me. And as I was racing back to the airport to get him, I heard about the second World Trade Center bombing. And then my cell phone rang. This is a modern story about cell phones. And it was my youngest son calling from Santiago. And I knew as soon as the World Trade Center thing happened, I looked to see what the date was, September 11th. I knew it was the anniversary of the overthrow of the democratic government of Chile. There's my son, my youngest son, calling, and he said, Mom, I just got tear gassed for the first time. I'm in a huge demonstration against U.S. imperialism here in Santiago. And he was very excited. He went on and on. You know, our family's a demonstrating, agitating family. So he had just gotten tear gassed. He was very pleased with himself. And after about 5 minutes of conversation, I said, do you know what's happening here in the United States? And he said, oh yes, I heard about it. And then he went on telling me about the demonstration because, of course, in his world, that was the defining shape of September 11th in the southern half of the hemisphere. So I think all the time when I think about what is the meaning of 9/11, that we must keep both of those in our minds.
So he had just gotten tear gassed. He was very pleased.
Both tragedies, really. And remember that it has been turned into an icon in the United States, that it has nothing to do with the tragedy of the families of innocent people who were killed on September 11th, but has everything to do with a revived and expansionist empire in a state of permanent war against the people of the world. So I'm very excited about what's happening all over Latin America now, and in a way, our recent gathering in Caracas has re-inspired me greatly.
What gathering? When?
We had a conference. I was invited to a conference that you were at, I believe, called In Defense of Humanity, La Defensa de Humanidad. ¿Es correcto?
Correcto.
And 350 artists and intellectuals from around the world were invited to come learn about the democratic Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. And indeed, I would say 350 artists and intellectuals were awed and stunned and inspired and very enthusiastic. The government of Venezuela is probably the most democratic government in the world. They have had 6 elections in the last 5 years.
8
elections in the last 5 years, all with an increasing mandate, with a growing popular support to transform Venezuelan society, to take the riches that had gone to a tiny oligarch, have the riches of oil, the luck of history gives them the riches of oil, and to really empower the poor of Venezuela, to bring healthcare, literacy campaigns, job development, college education, new opportunities for growth, and self-reliance economically, the development really of an agricultural self-reliance, of a manufacturing self-reliance, of jobs that are meaningful, that don't export their most valuable commodities and leave them dependent on imports. So trying to restructure and realign themselves with all of Latin America has been really inspiring to see the way in which the Bolivarian concept has been developed by the parties in Venezuela to embrace a Latin American view of alliances and regional solidarities, and again, the imaginative, the possible, what might be possible if Venezuelan oil went at reduced prices to Argentina, to Brazil, to Uruguay, to Chile, to Peru, to Bolivia, and their products came to Venezuela without having the United States empire mediate through trade agreements and through really control of their resources, their exports and their imports. So I think, and to seize back the cultural integrity of Latin America, to fight really around the issues of what cultural integrity is today. What do young people make as music? What do they want for themselves in the future? I guess I feel most strongly here at the World Social Forum that we're, you and me, our job is to support young people nowadays. Our job really is to recognize that we have not left our children and our grandchildren the world that we hoped we were going to leave them. Quite the contrary. But we still believe that this other world is possible, and that it will be a world in which capitalist and militarist and racist values are reduced to the ash heap of history. And I think I'm very encouraged by the average age of the participants here, by the average age of the demonstrators in the United States, although there are plenty of people of every age here and there who are opposing the policies of the United States government and of their allies in the world. I mentioned that the United States has more prisoners per population than anyone else in the world. We also have a very large number of political prisoners, and I think many people in the world don't realize that the United States has incarcerated and continues to incarcerate people who were involved in social struggles 30 and 40 years ago. I'm thinking about Leonard Peltier, about Mumia Abu-Jamal, about David Gilbert and Marilyn Buck, and many other people like that who continue inside the prisons unjustly. And now we have the case, now it has come to our attention, although it's a 5-year-old case, of the Cuban Five, of 5 Cubans arrested in the United States, tried in what can only be called a staged trial without reliable evidence in a very hostile environment, and sentenced to astronomical sentences for trying to stop terrorism, not for being terrorists, but for trying to stop the terrorism of some highly financed and armed Cuban Americans against Cuba and against the rest of Latin America. So the prisoners, the Cuban Five prisoners whose case is on appeal right now, seem to me to have joined political prisoners inside the United States and around the world as kind of symbols of conscience. And on the one hand, that arrest of activist, conscious people in some ways is inevitable, but I think you have to match that up with the detention, the unrestrained detention and extrajudicial assassination that the United States now feels free to do in the United States and all around the world. Obviously, the most egregious symbol of that is Guantanamo, where I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. You know, the prisoners who are released from Guantanamo to other countries in the world go free a day later. So they clearly were not high-level, leading, high-value intelligence terrorists as they've been portrayed. And this form of public degradation, the degrading, cruel, inhuman treatment and torture that they've been subjected to, many of them young people picked up on the battlefields of Afghanistan, where everyone knows child soldiers were used by all parties in Afghanistan. So you end up having children in Guantanamo, no surprise, incarcerated and treated along with the adults. It's extreme, the situation, I think, of incarcerating at will, of targeting for assassination people who are allegedly called terrorists. And in many ways, our challenge right now is to seize back language, to reshape language. Anyone who opposes the policies of the Bush government in the United States may be called a terrorist now, whether it's a professor who is exercising free speech, whether it's an Arab American or a Muslim citizen or non-citizen in the United States, or whether it's somebody anywhere in the world resisting U.S. domination and hegemony. And so I believe that our language we must invent a new language to make sense of these words, to make meaning. Clearly, states can be terrorists. Clearly, Israel occupying Palestinian land all these years, demolishing houses, punishing families, torturing people, bombing civilians, is not acceptable. It's state terrorism. When the United States does it, it's state terrorism. And when any country in the world does it, behaves in this kind of way, Russia and Chechnya, let's say, it is state terrorism. And terrorism is not simply a few guys dressed a certain way. It has nothing to do with religion or with civilizations. It's a degrading of human values that we all stand for.
Thank you again, Bernardine Dorn from Contra Corriente. This is Professor James Cockcroft signing off from beautiful Porto Alegre in the World Social Forum. Muchas gracias. Buena suerte a todos y todas.
Thank you.